Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint watercolor pumpkin. At the same time, I'll show you some basic and useful watercolor techniques to make your artwork cleaner and more professional. Here is the reference. I've already explained all the watercolor supplies in my previous video. You can check out the link right here. For now, we'll talk about only two different types of watercolor brush techniques that you can use. There is wet on wet and wet on dry. And combining these two techniques will really take your painting to the next level and make them look more vibrant. For the wet on wet technique, as the name suggests, I'm applying wet paint onto the wet surface of the paper. First, I wet the paper a little with the water. Then I add the next color while it is still wet. I don't let the paper dry so the colors blend together more and create a soft, smooth texture. The next technique is wet on dry. Here, after applying the first layer of the paint, we let it dry completely before adding another layer. This allows for greater control, more defined forms, and lovely transparent watercolor texture. Now, let's put these techniques into practice. I'm going to paint 3 pumpkins. The first with wet on wet, the second with wet on dry, and the third one combining both techniques. First, we sketch a circular shape for the pumpkins. Then we mark the top, the stems. After that, we draw the grooves on the pumpkin. The lines curve slightly near the edges, but straighten out as they approach the center. Now I'm going to draw 2 of these pumpkins blue. I'm painting the first pumpkins using only wet on wet technique. Before starting with watercolor, I'm lightly softening the sketch with kneaded eraser. I'm just wetting the pumpkins area slightly with my brush. And then I'm using cadmium orange for the color. We need to make sure to keep the highlight areas of the pumpkin untouched. Now, for the darker areas, we make the color more intense. I'm also adding a bit of sap green. With this technique, since we don't have much control over the paint flow, we need to be careful not to apply too much watery paint on the paper, or it will be hard to control. I keep layering the color one after another without letting the paper dry. Now I'm using some burnt umber for the darker areas and the shadows of the pumpkin. For the stem, I mix sap green with burnt umber. Then I apply burnt umber wet on wet for the darker part of the stems. As we've seen, with the wet on wet technique, it's hard to add fine details, but the painting gets a soft and beautiful blurred effect. Alright, now we move on to the wet on dry technique. First, we lightly soften the sketch, then I apply the first layer of cadmium yellow evenly. For the stems, I mix a bit of sap green with burnt umber and use it. Now we need to wait for the paper to dry. Once the paper is dry, I apply cadmium orange. If you notice, we now have a better control over the paint and the edges of the layers are a bit sharper without that blurred effect. Now we need to wait again for the paper to dry, and then we add the pumpkin's shadows layer by layer using burnt umber. Now I'm using cadmium orange, but we need to make sure not to cover the highlight areas. This technique is basically glazing. When we use this method, the color also mixes on the paper. To keep the colors vibrant and transparent and to have more control over the watercolor, the wet on dry technique is ideal. For the darker part of the stems, we use burnt umber, and we also make sure not to completely cover the green layer underneath. Now, to make the color more vibrant, I'm adding a layer of cadmium yellow. We wait again for the paper to dry, and then I add shadows to the pumpkin's grooves using burnt umber. Now the painting are gradually gaining depth and volume. Overall, the wet on dry technique is widely used in watercolor to add dimensions to your work. This is the wet on dry technique. Now let's work on the last pumpkin using both technique. Because when we combine wet on wet and wet on dry, the watercolor painting looks more beautiful and professional. First, we use the wet on wet technique. In general, it's better to do the first layers with wet on wet because we need to work on the overall painting first, placing the main colors and general shadows, and we want to work from the whole to details. Now I'm waiting for the paper to dry, and then we'll start with the wet on dry technique. Since we have more control over the paint now, we can add more details to the pumpkin and give it more volume. Now we wait again for the paper to dry, and then I add shadow edges using burnt umber. And that's it for today's painting. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comment which techniques you like it the most.